Welcome to the Trackpad's Military History Podcast, where we bring the terrain, the tactics, and the stories of soldiers to life. Each episode goes deeper than the written article, giving you a front-row seat to the battles that shaped history. Discover more at trackpads.com.
The story of October 3rd, 1993 begins with the whine of engines and the thunder of rotor blades over Mogadishu. In the late afternoon sun, American helicopters streaked low across the Somali capital, carrying Delta operators, rangers, and air crews who had rehearsed this mission countless times. The plan was bold but simple. Capture lieutenants of Mohammed Farah Aidid, load them onto trucks, and return to base before the city could react. It was expected to take under 90 minutes. Yet, as boots touched the ground, and convoys rolled into the narrow arteries of Bakara Market, the city itself awakened as a combatant. Within minutes, alleys became kill zones, crowds turned hostile, and gunfire echoed from rooftops. What began as a textbook raid would transform into a night of chaos that rewrote how armies viewed the unforgiving battlefield of the modern city. For the young Americans on the ground, the shift from confidence to crisis was swift and jarring. Trained in precision, they found themselves instead immersed in confusion. Streets that looked straightforward on maps became twisting funnels of fire. Burning barricades forced convoys into narrow channels where RPG teams waited in ambush. From every angle came new threats: armed militia firing from doorways, teenagers hurling stones, civilians masking the movements of gunmen. Above, helicopters once considered untouchable were suddenly silhouetted against the skyline, easy targets for fighters who had learned to time their shots. In the smoke and noise, the line between victory and disaster blurred. Every ranger, operator, and pilot understood that survival depended less on rehearsed plans and more on sheer willpower and split-second judgment. As the firefight expanded, the original mission collapsed under the weight of friction. Convoys carrying detainees and wounded soldiers became lost in the maze, their radios overwhelmed with overlapping calls. Casualty evacuation points multiplied, each manned by exhausted medics working under fire. Attempts to regroup only invited more ambushes, as the militia adapted faster than anticipated. The quick in-and-out strike had become a sprawling urban fight, with Task Force Ranger pinned down at multiple locations. Each passing hour tightened the city's grip. Nightfall brought no relief. Instead, the darkness amplified fear and disorientation. What had been a daylight raid now stretched into an ordeal, measured not in minutes, but in desperate hours of endurance. 32 years later, Mogadishu's story is more than a tale of soldiers trapped in a hostile city. It is a turning point in how the world understood urban combat. The battle showed that a city is not neutral ground. It is an active weapon, shaping the fight at every level. It demonstrated that even the best-equipped, best-trained forces can falter when terrain, population, and determination align against them. And it etched into memory the valor of those who fought against impossible odds, leaders at every level, medics working miracles, and soldiers who refused to leave one another behind. Mogadishu endures as both warning and lesson, a reminder that cities will always be the most demanding battlefields of modern war. The city as a weapon was never more evident than in the streets of Mogadishu. The Bakara Market District, a sprawling labyrinth of corrugated metal stalls, narrow alleys, and walled compounds, turned into a ready-made fortress for those who knew its secrets. For Task Force Ranger, vehicles that once maneuvered with speed and precision were quickly forced into crawling convoys, hemmed in by bottlenecks that negated their power. The irregular layout of the streets created natural kill zones where gunfire rained from above and from the shadows. Every building had the potential to conceal fighters, every rooftop to host a machine gun or RPG team. The Americans had trained for urban combat, but the reality of Bakara Market was unlike any simulation. It was a shifting maze alive with danger, where the defenders dictated every corner story. Complicating the fight was the indistinguishable human terrain woven into the city. Mogadishu's streets were filled with civilians, many terrified, some curious, and others eager to aid the militia. Gunmen melted into these crowds with ease, appearing as unarmed figures one moment and re-emerging seconds later with rifles. Spotters perched in windows or on rooftops relayed convoy positions by radio, while children darted through alleys to signal approaching Americans. For Task Force Ranger, this meant every crowd was a potential ambush, every bystander a possible enemy. The moral and tactical challenge of fighting within a sea of civilians magnified stress and confusion. Soldiers confronted the impossible: how to identify and fight a dispersed enemy that wore the face of the city itself. The defenders also reshaped the terrain into deliberate traps. Burned-out vehicles, piles of rubble, and hastily built barricades blocked intersections and forced convoys into predetermined choke points. Smoke from burning tires filled the air, obscuring vision and creating fiery beacons that rallied fighters to hotspots. Each barricade was carefully sited to funnel vehicles into narrow lanes where RPGs had clear shots. The improvisation of Somali fighters was startling. They lacked tanks or artillery, but compensated with ingenuity, turning civilian junk into weapons that robbed the Americans of speed and freedom. In those streets, the militia held the advantage not through firepower, but through the ruthless manipulation of terrain and time. When night fell, the battlefield transformed again. Darkness was supposed to favor the Americans, equipped with night vision gear and advanced optics. Instead, dust from firefights, smoke from burning barricades, and the blinding glare of tracers and muzzle flashes overwhelmed technology. The city came alive with sound shouts echoing through alleys, bursts of gunfire bouncing unpredictably off concrete, and the constant roar of engines and helicopters overhead. Soldiers described sensory overload, where vision, hearing, and even smell blurred into a single wall of chaos. In that environment, night vision devices became more hindrance than help, and the city gave the advantage to fighters who knew every alley by heart. Mogadishu, cloaked in smoke and shadow, proved that even darkness could be wielded as a weapon. Perhaps the most insidious weapon of the city was its very map. Task Force Ranger entered with rehearsed routes and marked objectives, but Mogadishu defied cartography. Streets that appeared straight twisted unexpectedly, intersections disappeared behind barricades, and landmarks looked different amid smoke and rubble. Convoy leaders relying on memory and radio guidance found themselves lost, sometimes just blocks from their intended positions. GPS technology, still in its infancy, could not provide the precision needed. Radio calls crackled with confusion, as units tried to find one another in the maze, often while under heavy fire. What seemed like poor navigation was, in truth, the city itself conspiring to disorient its adversaries. Mogadishu turned maps into lies, erasing certainty and magnifying chaos, until survival became the only reliable compass. The plan that brought Task Force Ranger into Mogadishu was crafted with precision, but the friction of war quickly stripped it bare. The mission's intent was clear. Delta operators would raid a meeting near the Olympic Hotel, Rangers would secure blocking positions, and a ground convoy would extract the force along pre-planned routes. It was designed to be fast, surgical, and overwhelming. On paper, the operation reflected years of training in special operations raids, insert, seize, exfiltrate, all before the enemy could mount a response. Yet the city refused to cooperate. Even as detainees were secured, the mission clock began to unravel, and commanders faced the first signs that Mogadishu had seized control of the tempo. The insertion initially seemed a flawless performance. Helicopters swooped in, ropes uncoiled, and operators fast-roped with fluid precision. Rangers locked down intersections as planned, weapons covering the avenues of approach. The building was cleared with efficiency, and targets were quickly detained. For a brief moment, the raid appeared to validate every rehearsal. But in war, perfection is fleeting. The very complexity of the operation, multiple chalks inserting simultaneously, convoys threading hostile streets, helicopters hovering overhead, left no margin for error. As gunfire crackled from rooftops and alleys, those margins began to collapse. What had been a choreography of speed was suddenly vulnerable to the chaos of combat. The convoys faced the brunt of this collapse. Navigating Mogadishu's arteries proved far harder under fire than in rehearsal. Vehicles that should have surged with speed found themselves trapped in narrow streets, battered by small arms fire and RPGs. Drivers struggled to distinguish safe passage from ambush corridors. Radios, already overloaded with commands, filled with frantic reports. Casualties mounting, wrong turns taken, and convoys separated by smoke and confusion. What should have been a lifeline for extraction became instead a focal point of vulnerability. Each block traveled required sacrifice, and each wrong turn multiplied the cost in blood and time. Early disruptions magnified into dangerous delays. Casualty collection points were established hastily under fire, diverting men from the main effort and forcing decisions no leader wished to make. Should they press forward and risk leaving comrades behind, or halt and draw further enemy fire while stabilizing the wounded? These impossible choices sapped precious minutes from a mission designed to last less than 2 hours. Every delay allowed more militia to converge, tightening the net around the Americans. The raid's clean lines blurred into a patchwork of small fights scattered across the city. What was meant to be a rapid strike was mutating into a desperate struggle for cohesion. As daylight waned, the looming weight of night fell upon commanders and soldiers alike. In planning, time had been the key terrain get, in and out before the sun set. Instead, with convoys pinned down, casualties mounting, and militia numbers swelling, dusk became a moment of dread. Soldiers could feel the balance tipping, as the prospect of fighting through the night in Mogadishu settled like a stone in their stomachs. The plan had not accounted for this, nor could it have foreseen how quickly the city itself would rewrite the terms of battle. What began as a daylight raid was now slipping into the kind of prolonged combat no one had anticipated, and from which survival itself became the primary mission. The plan that carried Task Force Ranger into Mogadishu was intended to showcase the strength of precision and speed, yet within minutes the harsh realities of urban combat bent it out of shape. The mission itself was straightforward in design. Delta operators would strike the target building near the Olympic Hotel, Rangers would secure blocking positions at key intersections, and a convoy of Humvees and trucks would whisk detainees and soldiers back to base. In theory, the entire operation would last little more than an hour. The Americans had rehearsed every step, confident that their superior training and equipment would carry them through. But combat is never theory, and in Mogadishu, the city itself became an adversary. Every carefully drawn line of effort began to fray, and the rhythm of the mission faltered under the pressure of contact. For a brief window, everything seemed to work. Helicopters roared and low, operators fast-roped into place with fluid efficiency, and Rangers spread into their positions like clockwork. Inside the target building, Delta cleared rooms with practiced precision, quickly detaining ID's lieutenants. On the surface, the raid unfolded exactly as the planners intended. Yet while the assault force was succeeding in its narrow task, the broader picture was unraveling. Gunfire erupted from rooftops, RPG teams began probing flight paths, and convoys on the ground immediately met resistance. The synchronization that underpinned the operation air and ground moving in harmony proved fragile when exposed to the chaos of a hostile city. Mogadishu did not fight like a scripted opponent. It adapted with startling speed. The convoys tasked with extraction bore the brunt of this adaptation. Designed to surge quickly along predetermined routes, they instead found themselves crawling through constricted streets littered with barricades and burning debris. Drivers struggled to distinguish safe routes from ambush points, as gunfire raked their columns from all sides. Radios, meant to provide clarity, became overwhelmed with overlapping reports, calls for medics, warnings of wrong turns, and urgent requests for reinforcements. Vehicles became separated, creating gaps that militia fighters eagerly exploited. What should have been swift, decisive movement turned into a grinding, perilous crawl, where every intersection promised new casualties. The convoys, rather than being the arteries of escape, became points of vulnerability that bled men and momentum. Delays accumulated with deadly consequence. Casualties forced convoys to halt, establishing improvised collection points where medics worked frantically under fire. Commanders faced agonizing decisions: advance to maintain momentum at the risk of abandoning the wounded, or slow down and invite further ambushes. Each choice carried terrible weight, draining precious minutes from a mission meant to end quickly. The longer they lingered, the more the city closed in, as militia fighters flowed toward the sound of gunfire with remarkable coordination. The Americans were no longer conducting a raid. They were fighting for cohesion in a city designed to strip it away. By the time detainees were secured, the original timetable was meaningless, replaced by a grim realization that they were trapped in a contest the city was determined to win. As dusk approached, the final blow to the plan's fragile structure came with the setting sun. The mission had always been built on the assumption of daylight. Fast execution and exfiltration before night gave the city even greater advantage. Instead, the task force found itself pinned down and scattered as daylight bled away. Soldiers could feel the change in atmosphere, the growing dread that fighting through the night in Mogadishu would test them beyond imagination. What began as a carefully orchestrated raid was now a prolonged struggle for survival, its objectives forgotten in the face of mounting casualties and a city that dictated the terms of battle. In that moment, the men of Task Force Ranger understood that the plan had not merely failed, it had been consumed by the very environment it sought to master. When the first helicopter went down, the entire nature of the mission changed in an instant. Super 61, piloted by Cliff Wolcott and Donovan Briley, was struck by an RPG as it circled above the target area. The aircraft slammed into the streets below, twisting metal and rotor blades scattering across the alleyways of Mogadishu. For the men on the ground, the sound of the crash was a gut punch. The sudden realization that their assumed air superiority could be ripped away by a single well-aimed shot. The crash site became an immediate magnet for militia fighters, who swarmed toward the wreckage with ruthless speed. Rangers and Delta operators raced to establish a defensive perimeter, dragging the wounded to cover while facing withering fire from all directions. In that moment, the mission's objective shifted completely. No longer about detainees, it became about survival and rescue. The downing of Super 61 might have been survivable as an isolated event, but the city had more in store. Not long after, Super 64, piloted by Mike Durant, also fell to an RPG strike in another sector of the city. The shock rippled across the force. 2 Blackhawks down within minutes, both in hostile territory, both demanding immediate rescue. For a military accustomed to dominance in the air, it was a stunning reversal. The helicopters that had symbolized mobility and control now lay shattered in the streets, their very presence drawing in enemy fire like lodestones. Soldiers already pinned at intersections were now faced with the impossible task of reaching 2 separate crash sites through hostile territory, each step contested, each block an ambush. It was here that Mogadishu revealed its deadliest lesson, that vertical dominance could be undone by the simplest of weapons in the hands of determined fighters. The crash sites themselves became scenes of desperate improvisation and valor. Small groups of soldiers dug in with whatever cover they could find, chunks of concrete, wreckage, or overturned vehicles, and returned fire in all directions. Medics risked their lives crawling through open ground to apply tourniquets and stop bleeding. Ammunition was rationed as militia pressed in closer and closer, their numbers swelling with each passing minute. Communication with commanders was frantic, with requests for reinforcements colliding with reports of mounting casualties. The helicopters overhead provided what support they could, but the geometry of the city meant that close fire support was always risky. For the men huddled around the burning wreckage, every second was survival fought against an enemy that seemed endless and terrain that betrayed them at every turn. At Durant's crash site, the story of courage reached its most enduring chapter. Delta Force snipers Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart volunteered to insert, fully aware they faced overwhelming odds. With only their rifles and limited ammunition, they fought off wave after wave of militia to protect Durant and the rest of the crew. Their actions bought crucial time, but eventually both were killed, their sacrifice allowing Durant to survive long enough to be taken prisoner rather than executed on the spot. Their defense has become legend, earning them posthumous medals of honor, but in the moment it was simply two men doing everything possible to shield their comrades. Their stand is remembered not as myth, but as lived reality, an act of desperate courage in a fight that had stripped away all certainty. Overhead, little birds and gunships screamed through the night, pouring fire into enemy positions with relentless ferocity. Yet, even this overwhelming firepower was blunted by the density of Mogadishu's terrain. Every strike risked hitting friendly forces or civilians, forcing pilots to restrain their attacks even as their comrades bled below. The very advantage of American technology was muted by the intimacy of the battlefield. Soldiers on the ground could hear the roar of support overhead, but often felt isolated, knowing that the city's narrow streets and shifting crowds meant that the full weight of U.S. air power could not be unleashed. Mogadishu had turned the tables on America's most trusted weapon, proving that determination, adaptation, and the cover of the city could deny even the skies. For those trapped in the wreckage, the fight was not about victory but about holding on until relief could arrive. Leadership under fire became the defining thread that held Task Force Ranger together as the night dragged on. At the top, Major General William Garrison, overseeing the mission from the Joint Operations Center, faced an excruciating dilemma. He had been constrained from the outset by political restrictions that denied him heavy armor and broader coalition support before the raid began. Now with 2 helicopters down and convoys trapped in a hostile city, he had to make hard decisions with limited options. Each request for additional forces had to be balanced against the risk of escalating the mission into a wider conflict. Yet hesitation carried its own peril, as every minute lost meant more casualties. Garrison's role became one of constant triage, directing reinforcements where they were most needed while bearing the crushing weight of responsibility for men fighting for their lives. On the streets themselves, junior leaders bore burdens equal in intensity, though at a different scale. Captain Mike Steele commanded Ranger elements pinned down far longer than intended at their blocking positions. What had been rehearsed as a brief security task turned into hours of holding ground under relentless fire. Steele's men clung to their perimeters, shifting from offensive-minded raiders to desperate defenders. At the same time, Colonel Danny McKnight's convoys fought running battles as they tried repeatedly to reach crash sites. Every turn brought ambushes. Every attempt at maneuver ended in bloody attrition. These commanders improvised constantly, balancing conflicting priorities: rescue the downed crews, protect the detainees, evacuate the wounded, without the luxury of clear information or sufficient resources. Their leadership was measured not by executing the plan, but by adapting to chaos. The true backbone of the battle, however, rested in the non-commissioned officers who kept small units intact amid collapse. Squad leaders barked calm orders as tracers sliced the night, rallying frightened young rangers with steady voices. Drivers turned Humvees into rolling shields, positioning vehicles to block fire and evacuate the wounded. Medics crawled through streets littered with bullets to treat comrades where they fell, performing life-saving interventions with little more than gauze and grit. These acts of small unit leadership were the glue holding together a force that could easily have fragmented into isolated, doomed pockets. Veterans later recalled the image of sergeants standing tall in kill zones, their composure transforming fear into determination for the men around them. It was this layer of leadership, immediate, personal, unrelenting, that kept the task force alive until dawn. As the night deepened, salvation finally began to arrive in the form of coalition armor. Pakistani tanks and Malaysian armored personnel carriers, long requested but previously withheld, rumbled into Mogadishu's streets. Their appearance was not seamless. Differences in doctrine, communication, and language had to be bridged on the fly. Yet the effect was undeniable. Steel tracks pushed aside barricades, and heavy armor provided protection no soft-skinned vehicle could offer. Under their cover, convoys pushed deeper into the city, reaching beleaguered crash sites and extracting survivors who had clung to life through the night. The relief came at a terrible cost, but it proved the value of coalition forces working in unity under fire. For the men who had endured the city's wrath, those armored vehicles represented the difference between annihilation and survival. Even with armor and reinforcements, the final ordeal remained. Many soldiers, cut off from evacuation vehicles, had to fight their way out on foot in the pre-dawn hours. This movement, later immortalized as the Mogadishu Mile, was not a triumphant march but a grim test of discipline and cohesion. Soldiers advanced block by block, rifles ready, exhaustion etched into every step. The silence of onlookers along the streets was broken only by sporadic gunfire, the men knowing that at any moment another ambush might erupt. Yet the discipline held, and by dawn, survivors reached the safety of coalition positions. The leadership displayed at every level, strategic, tactical, and personal, was the only reason Task Force Ranger endured. In the crucible of Mogadishu, leadership was not an abstract concept, but the very currency of survival. For those who fought in Mogadishu, the experience was not just tactical, but deeply human, etched into memory with sights, sounds, and sensations that defy easy description. Rangers described sprinting down alleys lit by tracers, each step a gamble against an unseen shooter. The echo of gunfire ricocheted unpredictably, making it impossible to know whether shots came from ahead, behind, or above. Every doorway was a potential ambush, every rooftop a nest for RPG gunners. Delta operators clearing buildings found themselves in close-quarters fights, bursting through doors into smoke-filled rooms where the enemy could be only a few feet away. The sheer sensory overload, the roar of engines, the cries of the wounded, the acrid sting of smoke and cordite, created a battlefield that overwhelmed not just body but mind. For many, Mogadishu was less a mission than a nightmare endured minute by minute. The strain was compounded by the blurred line between combatant and civilian. Soldiers confronted the impossibility of identifying threats in a sea of humanity. Women and children stood in doorways, some terrified, others shouting warnings to fighters. Crowds surged unpredictably, sometimes parting to reveal ambushes, other times pressing dangerously close to American positions. Every decision to fire or hold fire carried enormous weight, with mistakes threatening both lives and legitimacy. Veterans later spoke of the moral exhaustion as much as the physical, the crushing pressure of making life-or-death choices under constant threat. This environment created a sense that the city itself was alive and hostile, its people and structures conspiring together to erode confidence and heighten fear. Amid this chaos, medics emerged as unsung heroes. Crawling into kill zones to reach wounded comrades, they performed triage with little more than determination and basic tools. Tourniquets improvised from strips of cloth, pressure dressings applied under fire, chest wounds sealed in the dirt of the street. Each act was a gamble with seconds in survival. Soldiers later recalled the calm voices of medics urging them to hold on, even as bullets snapped overhead. These acts of courage went largely unseen outside the battle, but they saved countless lives. Mogadishu became a proving ground not just for combat doctrine, but for battlefield medicine, pushing individuals to improvise under pressure in ways that reshaped military medical training for decades to come. The psychological burden weighed heavily as hours dragged into the night. Exhaustion gnawed at every soldier, muscles trembling from sprinting and carrying wounded, minds fraying under constant adrenaline. Thirst and hunger added to the strain. Water and rations were quickly depleted, leaving men to fight on little more than willpower. In whispered recollections, veterans described moments of near collapse, only to be lifted by the presence of comrades refusing to quit. The bonds forged in those hours were unbreakable, rooted not in abstract duty but in the shared determination to bring one another home. Every decision, every burst of fire, every staggered step was driven less by mission objectives and more by loyalty to the man beside them. Decades later, those who survived speak of the lasting imprint of Mogadishu in vivid fragments. The smell of burning tires returns in dreams, The sound of rotor blades sparks memory, and the faces of the fallen remain etched in conscience. Some recall the adrenaline that kept them moving, others the sheer terror that threatened to paralyze. For many, Mogadishu became the moment that defined their service, a crucible that revealed both the fragility and the resilience of human endurance in war. The battle's human dimension endures not in after-action reports but in the stories carried by those who lived it. Stories of fear, courage, loyalty, and loss that remind us that behind doctrine and tactics are always flesh and blood. The lessons forged in Mogadishu reshaped how modern militaries approached urban combat. The most immediate realization was that lightly equipped, highly mobile forces could not rely on speed alone when facing determined defenders in dense terrain. The city demanded combined arms infantry, armor, engineers, and aviation working as one. After Somalia, doctrine re-emphasized the role of armored vehicles in supporting light forces, not as heavy blunt instruments but as moving shields and platforms of firepower. Engineers were once again viewed as critical partners, tasked with clearing barricades and opening routes under fire. Training shifted from rehearsing raids on sterile mock-ups to embracing the complexity of sprawling urban environments. Cities were no longer side considerations. They were recognized as battlefields that could dictate strategy as powerfully as any desert or mountain. The helicopter losses in Mogadishu struck a deep chord, prompting a reassessment of aviation doctrine. Black Hawks had long symbolized dominance, yet Somali militia armed with little more than RPGs had shown their vulnerability. From then on, commanders insisted on randomized flight routes, higher altitudes when possible, and dedicated escorts for troop transports. Attack helicopters and gunships took on expanded roles, not only providing fire support but also acting as scouts and deterrents. Aircrews trained to expect RPG ambushes on every rooftop, adjusting tactics to reduce predictability. The lessons carried into later conflicts, where aviation assets operated with far more caution and coordination in urban areas. The night of October 3rd proved that even the skies could be contested when the city armed itself against them. Communications and navigation also underwent dramatic transformation. During the battle, overlapping radio nets created confusion, with reports of casualties, lost convoys, and shifting positions colliding in a flood of noise. Maps proved unreliable, and GPS was too rudimentary to provide reliable guidance. Out of this chaos came a drive for interoperable digital communications, encrypted networks, and the development of Blue Force tracking technology that displayed friendly positions in near real time. This allowed commanders to see and respond to the battlefield with clarity unimaginable in 1993. Navigation tools also advanced, integrating GPS with digital maps that could be updated and shared instantly. These improvements turned information into a weapon as vital as firepower, reducing the fog of war that had crippled Task Force Ranger. Perhaps the most human of Mogadishu's lessons was in combat medicine. Casualties were treated in improvised collection points under fire, with medics improvising life-saving measures in impossible conditions. From these experiences came the refinement of tactical combat casualty care, which emphasized immediate interventions like tourniquet use, airway management, and bleeding control performed at the point of injury. Evacuation planning became an integral part of mission design, not an afterthought. Later wars would prove the impact of these changes, as survival rates for battlefield wounds climbed dramatically. What medics improvised in Mogadishu became codified doctrine, ensuring future soldiers had tools and training forged from the blood of 1993. Finally, Mogadishu left an imprint on doctrine far beyond tactics and equipment. Rules of engagement, media impact, and coalition coordination became central considerations. The global broadcast of American casualties being dragged through the streets shocked public opinion and shaped policy in ways commanders could not ignore. Future missions accounted not only for firepower and logistics, but also for the presence of cameras, political constraints, and the necessity of coalition support. Training began to include not just marksmanship and maneuver, but also the realities of operating under global scrutiny. Mogadishu's lesson was stark. Wars in cities are fought as much in perception as in bullets, and no modern force can afford to neglect that truth. 32 years later, Mogadishu remains etched in memory as a defining moment of modern warfare. What began as a raid against warlord lieutenants became a night-long battle that challenged every assumption about technology, training, and superiority. For the Americans who fought there, the city became a crucible that revealed both the vulnerabilities and the resilience of elite forces. It was a reminder that no plan is immune to friction, and no military, however advanced, is exempt from the will of terrain and the determination of defenders. The lessons carved from those streets still ripple through doctrine today, shaping how armies approach the complex challenge of fighting in cities. Mogadishu was not just a tactical event. It was a watershed that forced a reckoning with the realities of urban war. The legacy of Mogadishu is inseparable from the memory of the fallen. 18 Americans lost their lives, their sacrifice honored, but never fully separated from the pain of their loss. The names of Gordon and Shughart became symbols of valor, their final stand at Mike Durant's crash site earning the nation's highest recognition. Yet alongside them were countless acts of quiet heroism, medics saving lives under fire, squad leaders rallying their men, and exhausted soldiers carrying comrades through the Mogadishu Mile. Their courage ensured that the task force endured a battle that might have consumed them entirely. For veterans, the night remains vivid, each detail etched into memory, each sacrifice impossible to forget. Somalis remember the battle differently, as a story of resistance against a foreign power. For them, it was proof that determination and adaptation could humble even a superpower. Civilians caught in the crossfire carried scars and loss that often go unmentioned in American retellings, yet their stories are essential to the full picture. The duality of memory heroism on one side, resilience on the other, ensures that Mogadishu cannot be seen through a single lens. It is both tragedy and triumph, depending on where one stands. This complexity cements its place not only as a U.S. military lesson, but also as a global reminder of the human costs of urban war. Ultimately, the legacy of October 3rd and 4th is cautionary. It warns that cities are not just battlefields, but living entities that shape the fight. They conceal, deceive, and resist in ways that neutralize advantages and amplify dangers. Mogadishu taught that technology must be paired with adaptability, that leadership is tested most when plans collapse, and that the bonds of soldiers are the true foundation of endurance. 32 years on, its lessons remain urgent. Any force preparing to fight in the dense urban environments of tomorrow must heed the warning from Somalia's capital. Cities are the most unforgiving battlegrounds, and those who underestimate them do so at their peril.
Thank you for joining us on the TrackPad's Military History Podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the battlefield, be sure to explore more articles, episodes, and series at trackpads.com.